The Hitman has spoken, and he didn't hold back. In an era where modern wrestling is flashier, faster, and more choreographed than ever, Bret the Hitman Hart just dropped a verbal sharpshooter on the entire industry. The WWE Hall of Famer, known for his no-nonsense in-ring psychology and old-school toughness, is calling out today's crop of superstars. And let's just say, he's not impressed.
I miss the ruggedness of the characters, like, guys like Kurt Hennig and myself.
So the question is Bret Hart just stuck in the past, longing for an era that's long gone? Well, Chris Jericho also had something to say, and it might just make Hart look bad. Let's get into it. The Hitman's controversial take. On April 1st, 2025, the wrestling world was set ablaze when Bret Hart appeared on the Ariel Helwani show and delivered a scathing critique of the current professional wrestling landscape. While the exact phrase "wrestlers are all by now" wasn't explicitly stated by Hart, his sentiments certainly conveyed frustration with what he perceives as a lack of ruggedness and authenticity in today's wrestling product.
You watch the product now?
I try to. I do. I watch certain guys, and I try to watch the pay-per-views. I find in a lot of wrestlers, and I won't necessarily name anybody, but I find that the wrestlers are more actors pretending to be wrestlers today than actual wrestlers.
But Hart didn't stop there. He continued, reminiscing about a bygone era when characters were raw, real, and battle-tested.
Like, I miss the ruggedness of the characters, like, guys like Kurt Hennig and myself, or Dynamite Kid, or that whole era of wrestlers that, broke into the business in the 70s or late 70s and early 80s.
Bret Hart's comments reflect a generational perspective, one rooted in his formative years when wrestling was characterized by a grittier, more physically demanding style. As a product of the Hart Dungeon and a third-generation wrestler, Bret's perspective carries significant weight. During the interview, Hart elaborated on what he perceives as the greatest difference between wrestling during his era and today's product, particularly singling out all elite wrestling for criticism.
And I find that today's wrestling, it's a little bit more about promos and your character on TV, and not so much your work rate. And I like guys that throw back a little bit more to the work rate. Like Roman Reigns is a guy that, for example, that I think tries really hard to earn the respect of my generation and be more realistic and just more credible, more believable, and not so much an actor.
Hart's assessment that today's wrestlers are more actors pretending to be wrestlers than actual wrestlers hits at the core of a fundamental shift in the business. He specifically laments the loss of what he calls the ruggedness of the characters, referencing wrestlers like Kurt Hennig, better known to many fans as Mr. Perfect, himself, and the legendary Dynamite Kid as exemplars of a more authentic wrestling style that has seemingly fallen by the wayside. What makes Hart's critique particularly noteworthy is that he doesn't paint all modern wrestlers with the same broad brush. He specifically praises Roman Reigns as someone who tries really hard to earn the respect of Hart's generation by being more realistic and more credible, more believable, and not so much an actor. This distinction demonstrates that Hart's issue isn't simply with modern wrestling as a whole, but rather with a specific approach and style that he believes has become prevalent, particularly in AEW. The timing of Hart's comments is also significant. They came during a pay-per-view week for AEW, which led some fans to joke about it, adding to the week's expected controversy, a common occurrence in wrestling media cycles. The wrestling business has long thrived on controversy and attention-grabbing statements, and intentional or not, Hart's comments certainly succeeded in generating buzz within the wrestling community. But to truly understand the depth of Hart's critique, we need to explore the evolution of professional wrestling styles and what exactly separates old school from new school approaches. The distinctions go far beyond mere preference and actually represent fundamentally different philosophies about what professional wrestling is and should be. Old school wrestling, typically associated with the 1980s and earlier, centered primarily around character-driven storytelling with relatively basic in-ring moves. Wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and Bruno Sammartino became icons not necessarily because of complex movesets or high-flying antics, but because of their distinct personalities and the emotional investment they generated from audiences. In contrast, new school wrestling from the late 1990s onward has increasingly emphasized athleticism, innovation, and more spectacular in-ring action. Wrestlers like Ricochet and Will Ospreay exemplify this approach, combining breathtaking aerial maneuvers with technical prowess that would have been rare in previous eras. This evolution hasn't occurred in isolation. It reflects broader changes in entertainment, audience expectations, and even the business structure of professional wrestling. With the territoriality system long gone, and WWE having had a near monopoly for years until AEW's emergence, the ways wrestlers develop and the styles they adopt have transformed dramatically. Speaking of transformations, it's fascinating to observe how even veteran performers who came up in earlier eras have had to adapt to these changing dynamics. Take Chris Jericho, for instance, who shared his own revelatory moment about adjusting to new wrestling styles during an interview.
I learned very early on. It actually happened to me in 2016 when I went back to WWE, and I'd be working with Seth Rollins, and Seth Rollins would do 3 topes in a row. I was like, doing? In my day, you do 1 tope and that's it. You don't do 3 topes in a row. And then I realized, hey, get your head out of your... This is the way it is now. Learn from it.
Jericho didn't stop there. He admitted that even keeping up with newer talent was a learning curve, and one that challenged his instincts as a traditionalist.
I follow, obviously, online and read, Dirt Sheet or whatever, but, I didn't know who Darby Allin was. I didn't know who Orange Cassidy is. And so Orange Cassidy comes in, and I was watching him going obviously your initial things, this sucks. It's stupid. He's gonna stand there, he's get his hands in his pockets, he's kicking you, gotta sell this. And then I'm head out of...
Jericho's experience highlights a fundamental truth about the wrestling business. It constantly evolves, and veteran performers must either adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. Jericho chose adaptation, embracing newer styles and performers like Orange Cassidy, whom he initially dismissed but later came to appreciate as a genius for his unique character work. However, Hart's criticism seems to suggest that this evolution has come at a cost, the loss of what he considers authentic, credible wrestling in favor of theatrics and acting. Rather than adaptation, Hart appears to be calling for a return to fundamentals, to the ruggedness and realism that characterized his era and the generations that preceded him. But is this perspective merely nostalgia, or does Hart's critique touch on legitimate concerns about the direction of modern professional wrestling? To answer that, we need to examine the specific elements that differentiate old school from new school approaches, as well as the controversies surrounding both. Old school vs. new school, the evolution of wrestling. The divide between old school and new school wrestling extends far beyond mere stylistic preferences. It encompasses fundamental differences in approaches to safety, representation, and the very definition of what constitutes good wrestling. To fully appreciate Bret Hart's criticism of the current product, we must explore these differences in depth. One of the most significant evolutions between the eras has been in the area of performer safety. Old school wrestling often lacked many modern safeguards, resulting in dangerous practices that led to long-term health consequences for performers. The infamous chair shot from The Rock to Mick Foley during their I Quit match stands as a stark reminder of the risks wrestlers took in that era, with Foley later revealing he received multiple unprotected shots to the head while handcuffed, leading to concussion issues. These practices have resulted in significant controversy and even legal action, with numerous former wrestlers filing lawsuits against WWE seeking compensation for the long-term health impacts they've suffered. The effects of repeated concussions, particularly from unprotected chair shots to the head, have led to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, and other neurological conditions in many former performers. In contrast, new school wrestling has implemented much stricter safety protocols, including bans on unprotected headshots, concussion testing, and modifications to high-risk moves. While these changes have undoubtedly protected performers' long-term health, some fans and veterans argue that they've come at the cost of perceived danger and intensity that made wrestling compelling in earlier eras. This perspective is reflected in criticisms from some old-school performers who feel that modern wrestling looks too cooperative and lacks the struggle that makes matches believable.
No struggle. The lockup was great. If you watch that Ricochet and Will Ospreay match, my favorite part of the entire spot was the lockup. Good lockup, solid lockup, struggle, push against the ropes, try to jockey for position. That's the essence. If there's one word to describe any pro wrestling match, at least ones that are good and have foundational psychology, is struggle. The struggle. Meaning it doesn't always have to be clean. It doesn't have to look cooperative. The trick is to cooperate without looking like you're cooperating.
Another significant evolution between old school and new school approaches has been in the representation and treatment of women in wrestling. In earlier eras, women's matches often prioritized sex appeal over athletic competition, with bouts like bra and panty matches, evening gown contests, and other spectacles that objectified female performers. While there were certainly talented female wrestlers during this period, like Trish Stratus and Lita, the overall approach often reduced women to their appearance rather than their athletic abilities. The new school era has seen a dramatic shift in this regard, with women now featured as serious athletes capable of headlining major events. The four horsewomen of WWE, Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, Sasha Banks, and Bayley, made history when they participated in the first ever women's main event at WrestleMania 35. Similarly, performers like Serena Deeb, Thunder Rosa, and Dr. Britt Baker in AEW have been presented as legitimate competitors whose matches are judged by the same standards as their male counterparts. This evolution represents a positive development in terms of equity and representation, though it's worth noting that some veterans from earlier eras, including Hart, have expressed appreciation for this progress even while criticizing other aspects of modern wrestling. The business structure of wrestling has also evolved significantly between these eras. Old school wrestling was defined by the territory system, with regional promotions like Bill Watts's Mid-South Wrestling and Jerry Lawler's Memphis Wrestling providing structured development paths for wrestlers. These territories allowed performers to refine their craft through repeated appearances in front of different audiences, developing their character work and in-ring abilities gradually. In contrast, the new school era initially saw WWE dominate as a near monopoly following the purchase of WCW, leading to fewer opportunities for wrestlers to develop in different environments. However, recent years have seen increased competition from promotions like AEW, Ring of Honor, Impact Wrestling, and others, creating a more diverse landscape that in some ways mirrors the territorial days, albeit on a more global scale. This context helps us understand why Hart might be particularly critical of AEW, which has positioned itself as an alternative to WWE with a greater emphasis on in-ring action and athletic performances. While many fans have embraced AEW's approach, Hart's comments suggest he sees their style as prioritizing spectacle over the fundamentals of making wrestling look credible and realistic. The debate over these approaches extends to specific in-ring practices, including the protection of finishing moves. In old school wrestling, a wrestler's finishing move was treated as sacrosanct, rarely kicked out of and protected to maintain its credibility as a match ender. Modern wrestling, particularly in major events, often features multiple false finishes, where wrestlers kick out of what would previously have been decisive maneuvers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most prominent one where it kind of made sense if you were ever going to do it was WrestleMania 18 with Hogan and The Rock, where they exchanged finishes, but they were exchanging like Hogan gave him the rock bottom and Rocky kicked out of his finish that was stolen by Hogan. See, in that way, because that shows that Hogan can't do it as well as The Rock. And then Rock hit Hogan with 3 of them, I believe, to beat him. It's become a WrestleMania tradition, but now it's becoming a weekly tradition.
This critique highlights how what was once a rare special moment, kicking out of a finisher at a major event like WrestleMania, has become commonplace in regular weekly television matches. The speaker argues that this devalues finishing moves, making them less special and ultimately less effective as storytelling devices. Another aspect of the old school versus new school debate concerns the structure and psychology of matches. Old school wrestling typically built matches gradually, establishing clear dynamics between heel, villain, and face, hero performers, and carefully constructing moments of hope and despair for the audience. The pace would build toward a climactic finish, with each segment of the match serving a specific purpose in the overall narrative. New school matches often start at a higher tempo and may feature less clear-cut heel-face dynamics, with both performers showcasing athletic abilities that audiences appreciate regardless of their character alignment. This approach has been criticized by some veterans as lacking the psychological depth of traditional wrestling, though defenders argue it simply represents a different, equally valid approach to the art form. The tension between these approaches is evident in criticisms of modern wrestling's choreographed nature.
Here's what I figure is the issue, is that people see a move, they try to imitate it, but nobody anywhere is ever explaining the theory of why this move is not even the psychology of where the move is placed. But let's say between a lockup and a DDT or an Irish whip or whatever, they imitate where the arms go and where the body should be, but the theory or the mechanics of why a move works.
This critique suggests that modern wrestlers often imitate the visual aspects of moves without understanding the underlying theory or psychology. Why a particular move would be effective in a specific situation, how it should be executed to look like it could work in a genuine confrontation, and where it belongs in the overall structure of a match. It's a criticism that echoes Hart's concern about wrestlers being actors pretending to be wrestlers, rather than performers who understand the fundamental craft of wrestling. Even something as basic as a lockup, the traditional starting point for many wrestling matches, has become a point of contention between old school and new school approaches. The critique extends to specific in-ring behaviors that have become conventions in modern wrestling, but may undermine believability.
Because I'm holding on to it and it's just, I'm not giving it to you right away. It's a struggle, but it's too cooperative and there's no struggle and everybody's helping everybody out. And God forbid if somebody's not in the same spot. Have you seen the deer in the headlights? Deer in the headlights when someone's not, you're supposed to be in this corner and they run everybody over to the other corner. You got 4 corners to do it. It could be any corner you want, but it's so weird.
This highlights another aspect of the believability issue, the visible cooperation between performers in modern wrestling, where wrestlers are clearly helping each other execute moves rather than creating the illusion of competition and resistance. The speaker notes how disoriented performers become when someone isn't in the exact predicted position, suggesting an over-reliance on choreography rather than the ability to adapt and maintain the illusion of a genuine contest. These criticisms touch on what Hart seems to be addressing in his comments about actors pretending to be wrestlers, the prioritization of executing spectacular moves over creating a believable contest that audiences can invest in emotionally. From this perspective, the issue isn't simply stylistic preference, but a fundamental understanding of what makes professional wrestling effective as an art form. However, it's important to acknowledge that new school approaches have their own merits and defenders. The increased athleticism of modern performers is undeniable, with many executing moves that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The diversity of styles available to audiences has expanded dramatically, from the high-flying lucha libre influence to strong style striking to technical mat wrestling, all sometimes within the same promotion or even the same match. Moreover, the increased emphasis on safety has protected performers from the kinds of career-ending and life-altering injuries that were common in earlier eras. While this may come at some cost to perceived intensity, it's difficult to argue against changes that preserve wrestlers' long-term health and well-being. Fully appreciate the implications of Bret Hart's critique, we need to consider various perspectives on this ongoing debate and explore possible paths forward that might balance tradition and innovation. Balancing tradition and innovation. One particularly interesting voice in this conversation is Chris Jericho, who bridged both eras as an active performer and has had to adapt his approach over time. His evolution from initial skepticism toward Orange Cassidy to appreciation offers insight into how veterans can find value in newer approaches. Jericho's willingness to engage with new styles and performers illustrates an adaptive mindset that recognizes the constantly evolving nature of professional wrestling. Rather than dismissing Orange Cassidy's unorthodox approach, Jericho sought to understand why it connected with audiences and found ways to integrate it into compelling storylines. This represents a bridge-building approach that honors tradition while embracing innovation. His now famous head out of your moment sums it up perfectly. It reflects a mindset rooted in humility and longevity, one that acknowledges the wrestling business is always evolving, and those who refuse to adapt get left behind. This is where he diverges sharply from someone like Bret Hart, whose more rigid purist view paints modern wrestling as having lost its soul in favor of flashy theatrics and diluted physicality. But the evolution of professional wrestling isn't limited to in-ring styles or storytelling. Behind the curtain, the industry has undergone even more dramatic shifts, particularly in areas of performer safety, health, and representation. Today, concussion protocols are mandatory. Unprotected chair shots to the head have been all but eliminated in mainstream promotions. High-risk maneuvers are either banned or heavily monitored. These changes haven't just extended careers, they've quite literally saved lives. In contrast, wrestling in past decades was brutal, not just in its aesthetic, but in its consequences. Owen Hart's tragic death in 1999 during a failed stunt entrance remains one of the darkest moments in wrestling history, exposing the danger of high-risk production protection elements without adequate safeguards. Similarly, Darren Drozdov was paralyzed during a botched powerbomb in a 1999 WWE match, a sobering example of how even routine maneuvers can become life-changing under the wrong conditions. In Japan, Mitsuharu Misawa lost his life in the ring after suffering a cervical spinal cord injury from a suplex, a signature move of the country's strong style that often blurs the line between performance and real punishment. Pero Aguayo Jr. met a similar fate in 2015 when a seemingly standard rope spot resulted in fatal cervical trauma mid-match. And then there are stories like that of Tyson Kidd, whose career ended instantly after taking Samoa Joe's Muscle Buster, a move not typically seen as high risk, yet one that caused a catastrophic neck injury requiring spinal fusion surgery. Hayabusa suffered a similar fate when a failed moonsault left him paralyzed, serving as a haunting reminder of the risks embedded in high-flying innovation. These aren't just cautionary tales. They're the reason the industry has gradually evolved to implement stricter safety measures. Concussion protocols are now standard. Unprotected chair shots to the head are largely banned. Many high-risk moves have been modified, restricted, or retired altogether in top promotions. These changes haven't just extended careers, they've saved lives. But not all changes in the wrestling world were driven by evolving in-ring techniques. Some of the most significant and controversial shifts were forced by scandals that exposed the dark underbelly of an industry once shrouded in secrecy and unaccountability. And at the center of many of these stories stood one towering figure, Vince McMahon. In the early 90s, the Ring Boy scandal rocked the then WWF, now WWE, when multiple underage employees accused company officials of sexual harassment and misconduct. One of the most publicized allegations involved former ring attendant Tom Cole, who claimed he was sexually assaulted by company staffers. The fallout led to firings and resignations, including that of longtime ring announcer Mel Phillips and WWF front office figure Terry Garvin. Though McMahon denied personal involvement, the scandal cracked open the industry's carefully controlled public image and made it clear that not everything backstage matched the cartoonish, family-friendly persona projected on screen. Then came the steroid scandal of 1994. McMahon was indicted by the U.S. government for allegedly conspiring to distribute anabolic steroids to his wrestlers. The trial became a media circus, with Hulk Hogan testifying that McMahon had not pressured him to take steroids, though he admitted using them frequently. McMahon was eventually acquitted, but the case tarnished the company's credibility and spotlighted the extreme pressure wrestlers faced to maintain massive physiques, often at the expense of their health. Fast forward to the modern day, and the scandals haven't disappeared. They've just become more public and harder to hide. In January 2024, former WWE employee Janelle Grant filed a lawsuit against McMahon, alleging sexual assault, trafficking, and long-term psychological abuse. The explosive case also called into question WWE's use of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, alleging that Grant was pressured into silence through legal intimidation. This lawsuit not only triggered a federal investigation, but reignited public discourse on workplace harassment and accountability within WWE's corporate structure. As the legal firestorm intensified, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, charged McMahon with failing to disclose $10.5 million in hush money payments made to former employees to suppress similar allegations. In January 2025, he settled the charges by paying a $400,000 civil fine and reimbursing WWE $1.30 million without admitting guilt. However, the damage was done. The scandal led to McMahon's resignation from the WWE board and marked the most definitive end to his decades-long reign as wrestling's most powerful executive. These incidents weren't just personal blemishes. They exposed systemic issues within the wrestling business, the silencing of victims, the glorification of dangerous physical standards, and a culture that often prioritized profit and performance over safety and ethics. For decades, these darker truths lurked beneath the ring lights and pyrotechnics. But now, in an era of transparency and accountability, they're forcing the industry to confront itself. So while veterans like Hart may mourn the loss of a grittier era, there's no denying that wrestling today is safer, more inclusive, and better equipped to protect its performers, physically and mentally, than ever before. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.